Afternoon, folks. Hope everybody is doing okay wherever you happen to be. Just so you know, if you're picking up this right now, this is part 3 of 3 in my series of lessons on cell division and the workings of mitosis and meiosis. If you have not already watched the previous 2, I recommend you go back and check those out now in preparation for all of this. Also, if you are in my bio class, you will find on Blackboard a handout with important terminology and diagrams related to mitosis and meiosis that should help you in following along. I recommend you keep that handy during the course of this discussion. All right, so last time we went through this process of mitosis and the process of meiosis step by step. So you should at this point have a pretty good handle on how those two processes work. Now that we have that stuff down, now that we've talked about how chromosomes work, how mitosis and meiosis function, how they differ from each other, and how they're alike, I want to finish out this chapter by saying a few words about some related topics to all of this. Now, first off, whenever you are experiencing meiosis or mitosis, I say you're experiencing, your cells are doing this, you're not aware of it, but a lot of this is contingent on everything going the way it's supposed to. What I've described to you is what happens when things go correctly. Now, here's the thing. Stuff can go wrong. This process does not always work out the way that it's supposed to. And if there's a failure of mitosis or meiosis, more often than not, that's going to result in the death of one or more of the daughter cells and a failure to produce the appropriate daughter cells that you're supposed to. Sometimes you can have an error that happens because of mutation, in which the genetic information was copied improperly during S phase going into this, and as a result, one or both of the new cells has the wrong genetic code. We're going to talk about mutation and how that works and how that affects things in a later chapter. We're also going to talk about a very fundamental failure of apoptosis, uncontrolled cell division, which we call cancer, in a future chapter as well. But right now, I want to talk about a different kind of error that can happen, a chromosomal error. Think about when you're engaging in meiosis. You know that during anaphase, you have the spindle fibers shorten and pull the chromosomes towards opposite poles of the cell. Now in anaphase 1, one of the things that has to happen is that the chiasmata have to break. Remember, you have those chiasmata holding together the sister chromatids up until anaphase 1. And whenever they start to pull in opposite directions towards the centrioles, the chiasmata break and that chromosome pair separates. Let's suppose it doesn't break. Once in a while, there is an error that will happen during anaphase 1 of meiosis called non-disjunction, 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 or sometimes you'll hear it called just a non-disjunction error. In a non-disjunction error, there is a failure of a pair of sister chromatids to separate during anaphase 1. The chiasmata don't break. And as a result, both of those sister chromatids get pulled towards the same pole of the cell. In other words, you've got an extra chromosome going towards one pole and too few chromosomes going towards the other. So at the end of meiosis 1, when a non-disjunction error has happened, one of the two new nuclei that we form will have 47 chromosomes instead of 46, and one will have 45. Now what this means further is you carry on into meiosis 2 with those cells. Each of them is going to divide again, and you're going to end up with 2 faulty gametes. You're going to end up with one gamete that is missing a chromosome because they both went the other way, and that has only 22 instead of 23. And you're going to have one gamete with a spare chromosome, 2 copies of one chromosome instead of just one as normal for a gamete. And it will have 24 instead of 23. Now you make lots of gametes. The average adult human female will produce approximately 4,000 fertile eggs during her lifetime. The average adult male produces billions of sperm every week. Odds are pretty good that those very few that were produced as faulty gametes are never going to be fertilized, because most of the gametes your body makes are never fertilized, period. In fact, I guarantee every last one of you has in your body right now some faulty gametes that are never going to have a chance of fertilization. But once in a while, one of those faulty gametes with the wrong number of chromosomes does successfully get fertilized and becomes part of a zygote. And now we have an individual with the wrong chromosome counts. Because remember, starting from that zygote, egg fertilizes sperm. Egg's got 23 chromosomes under normal circumstances. Sperm's got 23. Sperm brings its chromosomes to the egg. We now have a fertilized egg called a zygote, Z-Y-G-O-T-E. Following the fertilization of the zygotes, it's going to travel into the womb of the organism. We're assuming a human for this purpose, or a mammal, I guess I should be saying. That zygote's going to again begin going through a cycle of division. It's going to begin copying itself, undergoing mitosis, and making a larger and larger ball of cells. The zygote starts off as just one cell, divides into 2, then 4, then 8, and so forth, until you have a ball of cells called the blastula, B-L-A-S-T-U-L-A. And that blastula, I'm not going to go through all the developmental stages here. We'll talk that in bio too. But the blastula will eventually become the embryo, that is the immature form of the organism. The embryo will develop into a fetus, and the fetus, of course, will eventually emerge as a full living individual. We spend the first month or so of our existence in the blastula stage, folks. Until you're about 42 days old in your mother's womb, you don't have organs, you don't have a heart, you don't have limbs, you don't have a brain. You're a ball of cells, and they're largely non-differentiated stem cells at that point. But I digress. Getting back to the non-disjunction. Suppose that zygote was formed from a faulty gamete. Now it's going to undergo mitosis. It's going to divide and divide and divide again, which means that every single cell of that newly formed organism is going to have the wrong number of chromosomes. It's going to be copying that flawed information. A lot of times, this will result in death before birth. A lot of times, having the wrong genetic information, a chromosomal error, will result in the organism never being born in the first place. Generally speaking, you can't function right if you are missing crucial genetic information, and in some cases, having too much genetic information, having an extra chromosome, leads to the overexpression of certain genes, which is also potentially fatal during your development. So the majority of chromosomal errors that happen result in a fetus that spontaneously miscarries sometime before birth. And as a result, majority of them we never actually see. But once in a while, someone will be born with a chromosomal error. They'll be born with the wrong chromosome count for our species. The general term for having the incorrect chromosome count for your species is aneuploidy. A-N-E-U-P-L-O-I-D-Y, aneuploidy. Now, aneuploidy can happen in two basic ways. And again, we're going to use humans as our example. This can happen in any organism that reproduces sexually, but let's talk about us. First off, you have monosomy, M-O-N-O-S-O-M-Y, monosomy. Prefix mono, remember, means one. Monosomy is the condition of having one too few chromosomes. You're missing one. You came from the gamete that had only 22 rather than 23. As a result, your grand total chromosome count is 45 rather than 46. One of your chromosomes is unpaired, just one by itself, hence the term monosomy. We identify this condition more specifically by saying which number chromosome is afflicted. We might say, okay, you have monosomy 6, meaning you only have one copy of the 6th chromosome, for example. Some of them have specific names. Some monosomic conditions have a particular specific name that has been given to them in medicine, but for the most part, most of them are unnamed. And the reason most of them are unnamed is because monosomy is almost always fatal. Nearly all monosomic conditions will cause the individual either to not be born in the first place or to die within a couple of days of birth. There is actually only one long-term survivable monosomy in humans, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Now, the opposite situation is trisomy, T-R-I-S-O-M-Y. Trisomy is the condition of having an extra chromosome. That is, you have 47 instead of the usual 46. For one of your chromosome sets, you have 3 rather than 2. You came from the gamete with the extra chromosome, 24 rather than 23 on it. Trisomy, like monosomy, is usually lethal. Most of the time, you will not be born alive with that condition, or you'll die within, at most, a couple of years of birth. There are about a half dozen trisomic conditions that you can be born with and survive. But most of them still cause severe functional impairments, and most of them you don't really live past childhood. The best known trisomy in humans, I'm sure all of you are aware of, is trisomy 21, having 3 copies of the 21st chromosome. That is known as Down syndrome. And when you write that, you capitalize the D in Down, named after the doctor who first described it. Down syndrome, 3 copies of 21st chromosome. You all know the characteristic symptoms: facial features, structure of hands and neck, speech pathologies, learning disabilities. These are all common characteristics of Down syndrome. Most Down syndrome patients also experience certain characteristic heart defects. You may not realize that. At one time, it was generally expected you would die at about your 30s of Down syndrome because of the heart problems associated. Nowadays, we have things we can do about that, and Down syndrome individuals with some occupational therapy and so forth can live fairly normal lives. Now, let's talk for a moment about one special set of trisomies. Let's talk about trisomy of the 23rd chromosome. Actually, let's talk about aneuploidy of the 23rd chromosome in general. 23rd chromosome is special. 23rd chromosome in humans, if you do not know this, is what we call the sex chromosome. This is the chromosome that determines your biological sex. By the way, be careful about terminology here, because sex and gender are not the same thing. Sex is a biological term. It refers to a common set of reproductive and developmental characteristics. Gender is a sociological and anthropological term, which refers to a set of expectations and behaviors and social roles and rules and so forth that a society applies to a large group of individuals. Gender is usually, but not always, mapped to biological sex. It is not unusual for there to be more than one gender attached to a biological sex. Western culture is quite unusual worldwide in only recognizing, generally speaking, 2 genders. That is very much the exception rather than the rule for human beings. But in our discussion here, let's use the term sex, not gender, because gender is, again, a social construct referring to social roles and so forth, whereas sex is a biological construct referring to physical traits, involving primarily how you develop and how you reproduce. Now, I also want to point out before I go any further that sex, contrary to what you might think, is not a binary. It's best to think of sex as kind of a bimodal curve, that there are 2 tall peaks in the curve that we would assign to biological male, biological female. There's a fair bit of space in between, a little dip in the curve that is a lot less common. There's some space on either side that is a lot less common. But yeah, anybody who tells you there are only 2 biological sexes has not studied biology all that closely, because there are a lot of ambiguous cases. There are a lot of cases of individuals with ambiguous genitalia because of developmental problems. Individuals who've had the wrong hormone exposure during development might end up with genitalia that look partly male and partly female. You have individuals who are biologically one sex, but express the external features of another sex because of certain genes being damaged or certain genetic switches not flipping properly during development. It's possible for you to have chromosomes XX and appear completely male to all outward appearances. Likewise, it's possible to have chromosomes XY and appear completely female to all outward appearances. Needless to say, those individuals are not going to be able to reproduce properly. In fact, most of them don't find out that they have that kind of condition until they try to reproduce, find out they can't, and a doctor thinks to do a karyotype and see if their chromosomes are in fact a match for their outward appearance. But that's getting into a whole other set of phenomena. They're a little beyond the scope of this class. Suffice to say, don't expect sex to be strictly male-female in all organisms. There's plenty of middle ground. There are plenty of cases in which the apparent sex is not the same as the chromosomal sex. But let's take a look at the sex chromosome itself. Now, the sex chromosome comes in 2 forms. You might already know this: X and Y. The X chromosome is the larger of the 2 and the more complex of the 2. X chromosome has about 1,000 genes on it. Everyone needs an X chromosome. Okay, So everyone needs an X chromosome. If you don't have an X chromosome, you're not going to live, period. If you have a monosomy in which the X chromosome is absent, then that child will never be born to begin with. The X chromosome contains genes that everyone needs for survival. Now, there are two chromosomal configurations you can have for the 23rd. You can either have XX or you can have XY. The Y chromosome is a much smaller chromosome. It's a very small chromosome. It actually only has 72 functional genes on it that we know of. And it is exclusively dedicated to making the modifications to development to lead to male anatomy rather than female anatomy. That the Y chromosome is not needed for anyone. You can not have a Y chromosome, go completely fine, but in the absence of a Y chromosome, male development will not occur. So we all have an X chromosome. Every one of you inherited an X chromosome from your mother. Then you have either an X or a Y, depending on what dad passed on to you, because dad has an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. One of those two chromosomes ends up in each gamete. And as a result, you have a 50-50 chance of having male or female children. It is always dad that determines the sex of the offspring. It is a tragic fact of human history that in a lot of societies that traditionally valued sons more than daughters, women have been blamed for failing to bear sons, when in fact it was technically dad's fault the whole time. Not that dad had any control over it either. By the way, interesting thing here, you probably have no doubt heard about ways to improve your chances of having a male child or a female child, that you're more likely to conceive a male child at certain times of the month or certain parts of the ovulatory cycle, or certain foods make, male or female children more likely to be conceived. And as to influencing the sex of the child you conceive, if you want a particular one, nope, sorry, none of that works. Old wives' tales, complete folklore, nothing stands up to empirical testing. You got a coin flip. Dad makes equal numbers of X sperm and Y sperm, and there's nothing externally you can do that's going to influence which one happens to get to the egg first. So, normative condition for humans. You get X from mom, and you get either an X or Y from dad. If you end up with two X's, biologically female, X and Y, biologically male. But aneuploidy can do some interesting things here. Let's suppose you have a monosomy in which you got an X chromosome, but you did not receive a second sex chromosome. In other words, you have trisomy 23XO, with the O indicating the absence of a chromosome. So you have only one copy of the 23rd chromosome, and it's just an X. That is the only survivable monosomy in humans, and it's a condition called Turner syndrome. Capitalize the T in Turner, named after the physician who first described it. Turner syndrome is characterized by children who, at least at external appearance, look like girl children, by what we would assign female. That characteristically at birth, Turner syndrome children will have a quote-unquote webbed neck. They'll have a web of skin attaching their neck to their shoulders, usually cut off at birth. Turner children do not undergo normal puberty. They do not menstruate, they do not get breast development, they do not ovulate, they are always sterile, they will be of unusually short stature throughout their entire lives. Turner syndrome is sometimes associated with speech and learning pathologies, but usually not the sort that we would associate with, say, Down syndrome. It's the only survivable monosomic condition in humans. Now, there are several trisomies of the 23rd chromosome. Kind of going the opposite way from Turner syndrome, where you have just one X, we could have trisomy 23XXX, 3 copies of the X chromosome. That is referred to as poly-X syndrome, poly-X. Sometimes older texts call it super female syndrome. Poly-X is characterized by, again, we would normally assign female offspring, no obvious external features that would indicate otherwise. Poly-X women tend to be a bit taller than average. They tend to have a bit more muscular development than normal for women of their level of activity. They are about 93% likely to be sterile. Most poly-X women are not able to have children. Some report mild learning disabilities, typically associated for some reason with reading comprehension. But for the most part, poly-X is a condition that can pass more or less invisibly. In fact, a lot of poly-X women do not know that they are poly-X until such time as they try to have children, find that they are unable to do so, and a doctor thinks to do a karyotype to find out if there's a chromosomal reason why. Let's get into some interesting cases. Poly-X is kind of an invisible condition. How about trisomy 23 XXY? 2 X chromosomes, 1 Y chromosome. That is called Klinefelter syndrome. Capital K L I N E F E L T E R. Klinefelter. All right, so we got 2 X's, which is the normative condition for being biofemale, but we got a Y, which is the normative condition for being biomale. So what's the answer? Are Klinefelter individuals male or female? The correct answer is, biologically speaking, no. Klinefelter individuals have biological characteristics associated with both. Genitalia of Klinefelter individuals typically appear male. They will have a penis. They usually have underdeveloped testes, sometimes undescended testes. Klinefelter individuals usually small of stature. At puberty, they don't experience a change in their voice. They typically have kind of smooth, boyish-looking faces throughout their whole lives. Some Klinefelter individuals experience breast development at puberty. And given that most Klinefelter individuals are assigned male, needless to say, if you're used to thinking of yourself as male and suddenly you begin developing breasts, a lot of Klinefelter teenagers have some psychological issues associated with that. But in reality, Klinefelter is a great case that shows us that biological sex is not a strict binary. Now, interesting thing about Klinefelter, I think the most interesting thing about this situation, and Klinefelter individuals, by the way, always sterile. Hormone treatments can allow some masculinizing features for those that want them, but even then they will still not be able to have children. But we find that Klinefelter kids, for reasons we are not clear on, tend to show a markedly higher ability for spatial and computational reasoning than is normal for their age cohorts. For some reason, Klinefelter syndrome seems to predispose them to that kind of thinking, and a lot of Klinefelter individuals end up with careers in mathematics or engineering or computer science, things like that. We don't know why this is, but it seems to be enough of a pattern that it's been noticed. Furthermore, we have found that a lot of Klinefelter children are misdiagnosed when they are young as having ADHD. A lot of the behavioral features attached to Klinefelter present as looking like ADHD. So a lot of young boys who are actually Klinefelter individuals are diagnosed as ADHD when they're young. Now, last but not least, in terms of these aneuploidies of the sex chromosomes, let's talk about trisomy 23 XYY. 1 X chromosome, 2 Y chromosomes. In other words, the sister chromatids that were both Ys didn't separate from each other during anaphase 1. That is called Jacob's syndrome. Capital JACOB''S, Jacob's syndrome. Jacob's syndrome is the least likely of these to be noticed for a lot of reasons. Jacob's syndrome is believed to occur in about 1 out of every 1,000 live male births. But in a lot of cases, we're never going to know, because Jacob's syndrome does not really present with a lot of obvious features. Individuals with Jacob's syndrome tend to be a little bit taller than average. They tend to have slightly larger hands and feet relative to their frame than you would expect. Not like clown hands or anything like that, but you know. Sometimes they have a slight curvature to their pinky fingers and their thumbs. Sometimes they are going to have lower than normal muscular development relative to their level of activity. That's not unusual. But for the most part, Jacob males do not present with any obvious feature that would show that they were other than, you know, a standard XY male. They have normal fertility. They can have normal kids, although because they have 3 sex chromosomes, they are somewhat more likely than normal to have children that are Klinefelter or Jacobs themselves. Now, I think Jacob's syndrome is interesting, not because of its biological presentation, but because of a lesson it can teach us about the culture of science. Jacob's syndrome used to be called super male syndrome for the same reason that XXX was called super female. And a prisons population that was studied in Iowa in the 1970s found that the incidence of Jacob's syndrome among the prisoners was approximately 20 times higher than the population at large. This led the study authors to conclude that the presence of an extra Y chromosome naturally predisposed these individuals to having more antisocial or aggressive behavior. The logic holds up, and as a result, for many years, that was reported as a standard symptom of Jacob's syndrome, that Jacob's individuals were more likely to be violent, aggressive, antisocial, to end up in situations where they would have criminal tendencies, that sort of thing. Well, it was not until a few years ago that someone finally dusted off the old Jacob's syndrome study from the 1970s and attempted to replicate the results. The normative thing we do in science, of course, is the gold standard is, can you replicate your results? Do they do the thing that you think that they're doing when somebody else tries it again? And you know what? No one was able to get the same results. Other populations that have been studied have not shown the same thing. Going back over the original numbers from the 1970s study, it turned out the methodology was pretty sloppy. So we're not even 100% sure that their numbers are accurate, and no other population, prison or juvenile delinquent or any that was studied, showed the same sort of tendencies that the original study had predicted. It appears that the results of the Iowa study back in the 1970s were a statistical fluke. In other words, not indicating an actual pattern. And studies of Jacob's syndrome children in the decades since then have not shown any particular tendency towards greater amounts of aggressive or antisocial behavior. But that conclusion was largely accepted by scientists, basically without question, for the simple reason that it made logical sense. People are like, oh yeah, of course an extra Y chromosome is going to make you more aggressive, and there we see the culture of society and the belief that males are inherently more aggressive pasting itself onto our science and saying, well, extra Y means extra aggression, when in fact there was actually not empirical evidence to support that. And so the lesson I say that Jacob's syndrome teaches us about the culture of science is don't be too quick to accept a result just because it seems obvious. Because sometimes the thing that seems obvious is not, in fact, all that obvious at all. You'll always hear people read an article in the news or whatever, and they'll say, oh yeah, here's an article that says that chocolate makes you fat, like we needed a study to find that out. Yeah, actually we did need a study to find that out, because sometimes it turns out those things are not actually true when you go to sort them through. Keep in mind that if we were going with the obvious evidence of our eyes, we would have all long since concluded that the sun was in motion while the earth holds still. And we've known better than that for a good 500 years. All right, so I wanted to tell these stories about these sex chromosomes, partly to illustrate the complex reality of biological sex, that it's not as simple and clear-cut as people would like it to be, and also to talk a little bit about what aneuploidy can look like in a couple of examples of survivable aneuploidies. So that's why this little digression here. All right, but let's get back to another subject that I mentioned I wanted to touch upon back in my last lesson. So I went out of my way to tell you all that no two gametes are alike, that we have all these events that happen during meiosis that ensure that your gametes are not the same twice, that you have a different combination of your genes that you're passing on to your kids with every single egg or sperm. Always 50% of your genetic information, but never the same mix of genes twice. As a result, no two children from the same set of parents are going to have the same genetic composition. You might resemble one another more or less because you do in fact have the same parents, you are getting your genes from them, and on average you share about 50% of your DNA with any blood sibling that you have with the same set of parents. All right, sounds good. We can all accept that we are genetically more or less like our siblings, but we're not going to be exactly alike. But what about twins? Clearly there are some individuals who are sharing more than 50% of their DNA, right? So how do twins happen? It turns out that the way that twinning happens has nothing to do with meiosis itself. It's not involved with how the gametes are produced. You still make genetically unique gametes. That hasn't changed in your twins. Now, had I been teaching this lesson to you just a few years ago, I would have told you that there were only two kinds of twin. And you probably would agree with me, right? Identical twins and non-identical twins. Today, I'm going to tell you about three. Because a few years ago, we discovered that there is, in fact, a third kind of twin. Now, when people think of twins, the logical thing that comes to mind, the thing that you're most likely to think of when twins come up, is you think of what are actually called monozygotic twins. M-O-N-O-Z-Y-G-O-T. G-O-T-I-C, monozygotic twins. These are what we often call maternal twins, or more commonly, identical twins. Monozygotic twins, take that word apart, monozygotic, one zygotes. Monozygotic twins have the same DNA because they started as one person. They were the result of a single fertilization event, one egg fused with one sperm. You got a zygote. That zygote began to divide, began to split into 2 cells and 4 cells and 8 cells and so forth, and form that ball of cells, the blastula as I called it, that will go on to become the embryo. Well, in some individuals, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, the zygote, or rather I should say the blastula, will actually break apart into separate balls of cells. If that happens, each of those separate balls of cells can go on and develop into a completely formed individual. Because they started off from the same fertilization events and the same zygote, they have exactly the same DNA. So your identical twins, your monozygotic twins at a genetic level are truly identical. They have the same DNA, 100% genetically identical. They are basically clones of one another. They are always the same biological sex. Now you will find that your monozygotic twins do start to look a little different over time, because even 2 individuals with the same DNA are not being subject to exactly the same influences in their lives. They might live in different climates. They might have different diets and exercise levels. So you'll find that as they get older, you will tend to see more and more differences between your monozygotic twins and their appearance, basically as their bodies are experiencing the world in different ways. Your external appearance is partially the result of genetics, partially the result of your environment. But at a genetic level, they are still the same person. So that's your maternal or monozygotic twins, your identical twins. By the way, it is technically possible to have identical triplets. There are 2 cases in medical history of identical quadruplets, and there's exactly 1 case of identical quintuplets in medical history. Needless to say, these higher levels of identical multiples are not common at all. Triplets are the most next common, but even they are quite rare. There were about 20 cases of identical triplets in the United States in the last century. 1 case, the mom was in my class several years ago, and she gave birth to identical triplets a number of years back. But anyhow, though, that is still quite unusual, almost always going to be single individual, splitting into 2, and you'll have twins, as we think of them. All right, now the other well-known kind of twin is a dizygotic twin. D-I-Z-Y-G-O-T-I-C, dizygotic. Dizygotic twins are what we often call fraternal, F-R-A-T-E-R-N-A-L, fraternal, which means siblings, like a fraternity, but fraternal twins or non-identical twins. Now take that word apart. Dizygotic, 2 zygotes. Your dizygotic twins started off and have always been 2 different people. In dizygotic twinning, you have 2 separate eggs fertilized by 2 separate sperm. The normative condition for Homo sapiens, the norm for our species, is that when the female ovulates, she releases a single egg at once. By the way, here's a little fun tip for you. If you want to know the average litter size for a mammal, if you want to know what the normal number of offspring is for a mammal to have at once, you can almost always figure that out by counting the nipples and dividing by 2. Most mammals have twice as many nipples as the normal average litter size, because that gives them spare capacity, basically, in case they happen to have extras. Now, the norm for our species is to release a single egg at a time during ovulation. So normally there's only 1 egg available to fertilize. But once in a while, 2 eggs will be released at the same time, that you'll end up with 2 eggs becoming available at once. If that happens, it is possible for both of those eggs to be fertilized by separate sperm. You could also end up, of course, with 3 or 4, whatever number. If you have multiples beyond 2, it is almost always fraternal that you receive, where you've got just a bunch of eggs released at once. This is not uncommon when a woman is on fertility drugs. A lot of fertility drugs stimulate ovulation and might cause the release of multiple eggs at once. So whenever you hear anybody having more than triplets at a time, fertility drugs are usually involved. By the way, a thing we're not really clear about, it is more common in triplets to have two of them identical and one of them be, fraternal relative to the other two than it is to have either three that are all identical or three that are all fraternal. We don't know why this is. But in any case, though, so your fraternal twins are basically siblings who were conceived at the same time. They are no more genetically alike than any other two siblings would be from the same set of parents. So your fraternal twin is basically just your sibling who shared a uterus with you. There's no reason they have to be the same biological sex. They got two different sperm, so it could be one of them got an X and one of them got a Y. You can have fraternal twins that are the same sex, or you can have fraternal twins of two different sexes. But again, they're no more alike each other than any other twins would be. Or sorry, any other siblings would be. On average, they share about 50% of their DNA. Although here's a fun psychological thing. In our heads, we associate the word twin with people who look alike. And that means that when we know that two people are fraternal twins, we notice more similarities between them than if we don't have that knowledge. It's not that they actually look more alike relative to other siblings. It's just that we're paying attention for it. There was a cool study that was done that showed people pictures of fraternal twins. Some of the people in the study were not told they were related. Some of the people were told they were siblings, and some of the people were told that they were twins. And the people who were told they were twins noticed more similarities between the pictures than either of the other two groups. So a certain amount of that is our psychology. But what about the third kind? There is, in fact, another option. These were only discovered in the year 2007, and they are what we call sesquizygotic twins. SESQUIZYGOTIC. Sesquizygotic, also known as semi-identical twins. Now, this is a nifty thing that we only recently learned can happen. What happens in sesquizygotic twins is that one egg is fertilized by two separate sperm. Now, the norm that happens in our species is that when the sperm fuses with the egg immediately begins releasing compounds into its environment that kill any other sperm getting close. It's a way of basically preventing multiple fertilizations and the overduplication of chromosomal information. It's got what it needs at that point. But once in a while, it appears, by luck of the draw, two sperm make it to the finish line at exactly the same time. Two sperm simultaneously fuse with the same egg. Now, what this means is that we now have one set of maternal chromosomes, 23 from mom, but two sets of paternal chromosomes, 46 from dad, 23 from each of the two sperm. What happens when this occurs, and we didn't know this was even an option until about 12 years ago, is that the egg will then undergo mitosis. It is the only time we know of in humans in which the egg undergoes mitosis, in which a gamete undergoes mitosis at all. So the egg will split into two identical new eggs, and each of them will get one of those two sperm. As a result, your sesquizygotic twins have identical DNA from mom, because they started from the same egg, which then duplicated itself, but they have slightly different DNA from dad, because they came from two different sperm. On average, my sesquizygotic twins share about 75% of their DNA with each other. In other words, more than you would get from standard siblings, but not fully identical. Again, did not know this was an option until a few years ago. Some obstetricians think that it's probably a very rare event that happens. Others have suggested this might be the most common kind of twinning. And the reason for that is because the other two kinds of twinning seem to run in families. There seems to be a familial tendency for maternal or fraternal twinning to happen. And as a result of that, the likelihood of that is correlated to whether or not you inherit certain genes that make it more likely to happen. At least that's what our thinking is right now. It seems to run in families, both of those kinds of twinning. But the sesquizygotic twins, that doesn't require a gene. It just requires an accident of fertilization where two sperm get to the egg at the same time. In fact, some obstetricians have suggested this might be the most common kind of twin, But we don't know it because we didn't know it was an option, and therefore a lot of folks are running around probably thinking that they are a different kind of twin, probably thinking they're fraternal twins who just happen to look really alike, and when in fact they're sesquizygotic. So we don't know the incidence of this as yet. But it's a thing that exists in the world. 3 kinds of twins, folks. All right, now to tie off this unit, and this is not covered in the handout that I posted for you, so pay attention. I wanted to talk for just a couple minutes about asexual reproduction. Seems like a good time to bring this up, that not all organisms reproduce sexually. In fact, the majority of organisms, by the numbers, reproduce asexually. Asexual reproduction is any form of reproduction that does not require sex, that does not require the combination of genetic information from 2 different parents. All the genetic data comes from a single individual. Now, there are several ways this can happen. The most common form of asexual reproduction, actually the single most common form of reproduction, period, is binary fission. We talked about that previously. B-I-N-A-R-Y. Fission, F-I-S-S-I-O-N. Fission means splitting. Binary 2, splitting in 2. So binary fission is the most common form of reproduction among prokaryotic organisms. So virtually all prokaryotes do it, and among most single-celled protists. And in binary fission, this basically is a method by which the cell essentially reproduces via mitosis. It looks like the cell cycle with mitosis, except that the S phase and the M phase happen simultaneously. The DNA is being copied at the same time that the other events of M phase are going on. So binary fission is the simplest form of asexual reproduction. You got a 1-celled organism, it splits in 2, you now have 2 1-celled organisms. So that is our easy way, it's our default way. You might argue it's the default reproductive cycle for life. But how about a couple of other ones? There are a few other ways this can happen. Among multicellular life, there is a form of asexual reproduction called budding, B-U-D-D-I-N-G, like a bud growing off a plant. In budding, the offspring literally grows out of the body of the parents. If you've ever seen a tree with a little tiny tree growing out of the base of it, that's budding. You see this a lot of times with fungi, where one fungus will give rise to a whole bunch of other fungi that are all connected to it. You know how you'll see mushrooms sometimes, and a whole bunch of them will grow together in one spot? A lot of times, all those mushrooms are connected underground to a common parent. That's budding. A very few simple animals reproduce this way. Animals belonging to a group called the phylum Cnidaria. C-N, silent C, C-N-I-D-A-R-I-A, phylum Cnidaria. These are the very simple animals, including jellyfish and corals and anemones. Some cnidarians reproduce via budding, in which the new individual grows out of the body of the parents. Also, a couple of kinds of flatworms do this, where if a flatworm gets damaged, then a new flatworm can begin to grow out of the body of the original one, until eventually the 2 of them get large enough that they kind of pull apart from each other. Now, similar to budding is fragmentation. Fragmentation is a form of asexual reproduction in which a piece of the individual goes on to become a new individual. This is common in plants. If you've ever taken a cutting from somebody else's plants and grown it into a new plant, that's technically fragmentation. You've induced fragmentation. A lot of simple animals do fragmentation. Starfish. A starfish can shed one of its arms, which can then grow into a new individual. A sponge, simplest animals of all. If sponges break into small pieces, each piece can go on to become a whole new sponge. So simple-bodied animals can do this sort of thing. Complex animals, no. Sponges and starfish are about the only things that can manage that trick, in which a small piece of the individual can go on to become a whole new individual. Cut up a starfish into pieces or cut up a sponge into pieces, put it in nutrient-rich water, every piece will grow into a whole new animal. Now, let's get into some interesting ones. There is a form of asexual reproduction that is technically both asexual and sexual, and that is called self-fertilization. Self-fertilization happens when the sperm and the eggs are produced by the same individual. We typically find this in plants. If a plant produces both male and female flowers, it is possible for that plant to self-pollinate, for the pollen of the male flowers to end up in that same plant's female flowers, and as a result, produce new offspring from there. Well, interesting thing about that is that even though all the genetic information came from one parent, and therefore it's asexual, it's also still sexual because it involves the fusion of egg and sperm. And so in this, we're also going to find that although it is technically asexual, that nonetheless the new offspring do not match the genetics of the parent perfectly. Keep in mind that that parent had to make gametes. They had to make eggs and sperm. Each of those eggs and sperm was produced via meiosis. Each one contains a unique combination of that parent plant's genetic material. And as a result of that, when they combine, it's a random mix of the genes. Some genes may not have been present in either of those gametes, and therefore, even though they were in the parent, they don't end up in the offspring. Or some genes might be present in multiple copies for that reason. You might end up having more copies of a gene than normal. So it's not guaranteed that a self-pollinated individual will be exactly the same genetically as its parent was, although they're going to obviously be pretty close. Now, my favorite form of asexual reproduction, because when you teach biology, you have things like your favorite form of asexual reproduction, is a thing called parthenogenesis. 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 Parthenogenesis is a form of asexual reproduction, which you might think of as a backup way of reproducing if you are a sexual organism. Parthenogenesis happens among certain animals. We find it mostly in insects, particularly hive or colony type insects like bees or ants. You will also find it happening in certain simple animals. Some lizards, amphibians, and fishes do this. Parthenogenesis happens in a species that is normally sexually reproducing in most cases. Males and females find each other, they mate, they produce offspring. But sometimes, for whatever reason, there aren't enough males available. And what happens then is that in a parthenogenetic species, in the absence of a fertile male, the female will experience a process whereby her eggs undergo mitosis, but do not undergo cytokinesis. In other words, the egg duplicates its genetic information, but it doesn't split into two new cells. But now it's got diploid chromosomes, right? It went from haploid to diploid. The egg self-fertilized. In that instance, what you end up with are going to be offspring that are essentially clones of mom. They got all their genetic information from one egg from their mother. Parthenogenesis seems to be a stopgap in cases where, for whatever reason in the environment, there just aren't enough males for all the females to reproduce. So the females that are not able to find a mate basically self-fertilize their own eggs. Now, nifty thing that happened here with a couple of lizards. There's a species of lizard called the whiptail lizard, and whiptail lizards are all female. Because what happened here is that they started off long ago as a male and female species, but somewhere in the evolutionary history of that species, there was a crisis where there weren't a lot of males available, so most of the females reproduced parthenogenically, and then there still weren't enough males, and there were more females in the next generation, so they continued doing that, and eventually the male of the species died off altogether. As a result, now there are only female whiptail lizards, and they only reproduce via parthenogenesis. Pretty cool, huh? Now, really fun thing about that, they still have mating behavior. Female whiptail lizards will do a mating dance, you know. A lot of lizards do this whenever they are advertising their mating availability. They'll do this kind of mating dance where the male and the female meet, and they like bob their heads up and down in certain ways and puff their throats and kind of do this display that says, hey, here's my moves, you want to mate with me? Humans really aren't all that different if you think about it. But in the female whiptail lizards, the females will not self-fertilize until they've done a mating dance, which means two female whiptail lizards will see each other, they'll do their mating dance, they'll show off their moves to each other, and then each of them will self-pollinate. So we find this vestigial mating behavior even in a species that doesn't do it anymore. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, folks. So to close off this chapter, I'm done with this whole thing. I'm going to close off with a personal story, and this is just a little fun one that Years and years ago, I was at a Renaissance festival or something. I don't remember what event I was at. And I was in line getting some food, and there were two women in line in front of me. And they were talking about their kids. And I didn't mean to listen in, but you know how it is. You know, you're waiting, you don't have anything to do, and you overhear people's conversations. And these two women are talking about their children. And the one, she says to the other one, she says, now you know my two boys, and she gives their names. I don't remember their names. And she says, now the doctor says that they're twins, but I don't think so. And I was like, okay, where's this going? And the other woman's like, oh, well, what do you mean? And the first woman's like, well, the doctor thinks that they're twins because they were born at the same time, so I can see why he thinks that. And one of them, he's definitely a twin, but the other one doesn't look anything like him. I now deeply regret the fact that I did not butt in and ask her what the hell she thought the word twin meant, whereby somehow she could have two children at the same time. One of them is a twin, and the other one isn't because he doesn't look anything like the first one. It's troubled me ever since then, and now it can trouble you too. All right, folks, so that is the end of my unit on cell division. I hope you have all enjoyed. If anybody's got questions, get in touch with me, and I will talk to you soon. Hope you have a good day.